All right, in this video, we're going to wrap up the effects of the Cold War. And in this video, we're going to take a look at the last two places that we've been spending time on in this course. This is Persia, which is now known as Iran, and Latin America. So we'll start with Iran. And we briefly touched on Iran when we were talking about Iraq. Remember, when we were talking about Iraq, we said that the efforts to unify the Middle East more or less failed. And this effort was called Pan-Arabism. And when these efforts to unify the Middle East into something that looked like what was created during the Ottoman Empire, a new idea becomes more popular. Now, this was not a universally popular idea, but it was an idea that becomes more and more popular. And that was that Western ideas and Western culture, basically these ideas from the Enlightenment, like democracy or equality or freedom of speech or religion. These ideas, so Western ideas, Western culture, Western influence, however you want to put it, these were the things that led to problems in the Islamic world. So the solution to this problem is to reject Western ideas and embrace Islamic tradition and Islamic conservatism. And this idea is really easy to remember. This idea is called Islamism. And the place where we see this most visibly is in Iran. So let's talk briefly about the Iranian Revolution in 1979. Now, this wasn't the only place where we see Islamism. We could also see it in Syria. We could see it in Saudi Arabia. But this is the most visible example of Islamism. Most visible So to tell this story, we've got to go back just a bit. So we're going to go back to 1953. In 1953, the United States toppled the democratically elected leader of Iran. And they replaced him with what we'll just call an absolute monarch. Shah Reza Pahlavi. So remember when we've talked about Iran or Persia before, a Shah is just the Persian word for king. Now, the most important thing to note about Shah Pahlavi was that he was an anti-communist. And because he was an anti-communist, the United States ignored everything else he did. So he was a dictator. He was an authoritarian. He arrested people that he disagreed with, what you would expect out of a dictator. And the Iranians did not like him, and they certainly did not like the United States for getting involved in their government. So the Iranians grow to dislike the Shah and the United States. So we'll jump ahead to 1979. Now the Shah is out of the country. And while he's gone, religious and military leaders overthrow the government. And the new leader of Iran is a religious leader, and his name is Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini. And he is one of these Islamists. He believes in that particular political philosophy. Now, the Shah goes to the United States, and he soon dies of cancer. I believe that's why he was out of the country in the first place. He was meeting with doctors outside of Iran. Now, during the revolution, and this is why the Iranian Revolution is so infamous in the United States, during the revolution, the U.S. Embassy was captured and 69 U.S. hostages were held for about 18 months. And they were released in 1981. Now, I don't believe any of them were physically harmed, but they were psychologically tortured while they were held by the Iranians. Now, there were a number of effects of this. The first is that we see a big increase in the number of Islamic terrorist attacks. Against Western targets. And the idea behind these terrorist attacks is that they are spectacles. They are meant to be memorable events. And so maybe the most famous of these is the September 11th attacks. But soon after the Iranian Revolution, we see an increase in the number of these attacks against Western targets, because the idea is that Islamists want to force Western ideas and Western culture out of the Islamic world. The other more immediate effect, however, is that we see more conflict between Iran and Iraq. Basically, Iraq wants to take advantage of Iran's instability. Now, this puts the United States in a really awkward position because Iraq is still supported by the Soviet Union. And Iran used to be supported by the United States. So the question now is, how can the United States continue to support Iran, even though Iran has made it very, very clear that they want nothing to do with the United States? And that is going to be our weird segue into the last region we're going to pay a little bit of attention to, and that's Latin America. Now, Latin America is generally, for the most part, heavily influenced by the United States. Kind of the same way that the Soviet Union is heavily involved in Eastern Europe, the United States is heavily involved in Latin America. Generally speaking, and I will talk about a couple of exceptions here in a minute, but mostly they support anyone who is anti-communist. Which means that they supported a number of violent military dictators. So, for example, in Chile, they supported Augusto Pinochet, who was just a very violent military dictator, ruthlessly killed anybody that would oppose him, and the United States supported him because he was an anti-communist. And as long as they were anti-communists, the Americans turned a blind eye to any of the other human rights abuses they may carry out. So the question now is, how does this tie into what's going on in Iran and Iraq? Which brings us to the Iran-Contra affair. So, to recap, the U.S. needs to help Iran against Iraq, but Iran wants no help from the United States. And it was actually illegal for the United States to help Iran. So after the Iranian Revolution, the United States passed laws that said it was illegal to aid Iran in any way. So here is the more or less illegal plan to help the Iranians. The U.S. gives weapons to Israel, who secretly sells them to Iran. And I don't think the Iranians knew that it was Israel who was selling them these weapons. Then the U.S. takes these profits, which they can't keep, and they give them to anti-communist rebels in Nicaragua called the Contras, which was also illegal because the United States had gotten involved in Nicaragua so many times. The Americans passed laws against doing exactly this. So this was also illegal. Now, all of this comes to the public. So this all happens in 1981. This all becomes public in 1985, and nothing happens. Even though all of this is illegal, just about every piece of this was illegal, nothing happens. Because it's all in the middle of the Cold War, and basically whatever happens in the Cold War was a necessary thing to happen. Now, I did mention there are a couple of exceptions, and there are two exceptions to this general rule. These two exceptions are Mexico and Venezuela. Both Mexico and Venezuela have large oil supplies, which means they have their own source of money, and they don't have to rely on the United States. They sell their oil, and that's how they make a lot of money. And because of this, both Mexico and Venezuela are more socialist than other Latin American countries. Okay, so that brings us pretty much to the end of the Cold War. So I think we have 2 more videos in the World History series, and the next video will talk about the end of the Cold War, so what brought it about, and then what happened immediately afterwards. And then we're going to talk about the modern world and the various threads coming together to create what we're dealing with right now. So until then, this is Mr. Nissen signing off.